Hello, my friends, and welcome to the Thursday episode of Stand Up. I've got two really amazing guests joining me today. First, Andrea Chalupa is an amazing young journalist and writer and screenwriter and one half of the dynamic duo that is Gaslit Nation. You have heard Sarah Kendzior here on the show, and many of you listen and support that show as well. I had a really enlightening, educating, informative, thoughtful conversation with Andrea Chalupa about her life and specifically about what's going on in Ukraine and Russia. And it's one of the most important conversations certainly I've done in the last several months. I'm really happy about it, and I can't wait for you to hear it and let me know what you think of it. Then I also had a thoughtful and funny conversation with one of my favorite comedians, Trey Crowder, who you may know as one of the liberal rednecks. And Tina Winsett suggested I have Trey on, and so I've got him on as well. I don't have a news segment for you here, what I normally do on a Thursday, because I spent the entire night working the phones trying to get a major story killed because it was going to be told completely inaccurately, making a black girl in our local community look like an aggressor when she was, in fact, by many accounts, the victim. And so I've been working on that for the last 5 hours. And because of that, I didn't get to do the normal podcast. I hope you can forgive me. I literally have to go back to that and talking and texting and trying to make sure that this story, if it gets told appropriately. I will tell you all of the details about that at tonight's Hangout if you join us. Also, Peter Coyote is going to be there tonight. Peter Coyote will join us in the Hangout live, the legend. So that is tonight, 8 Eastern. If you're a subscriber, you'll get the link. It's on today's email. You'll get a reminder for every Thursday's Hangout and tonight. So that's the deal. No news, two amazing guests, Peter Coyote tonight, no ads. Just going to throw to my conversation with Andrea Chalupa, Trey Crowder. Put these videos up as well on YouTube. YouTube.com/standup with Pete is the YouTube. These and many more will be up soon, so check that out. All right, but let's start with Andrea Chalupa. I already told you a little bit about her, so I just want to let you know just a little bit more. But her website is Andrea Chalupa. That's also her name on Twitter. Like I said, Gaslit Nation is her podcast. And her new movie, the movie that she wrote the screenplay for, and we talk a lot about it. It's super important, telling the story of Ukrainians who were killed in a genocide that has really never been told. It's a very important movie and story, and it's called Mr. Jones. I highly recommend it. So, without further ado, I highly recommend you listen to the podcast, follow her on Twitter, let her know that you enjoyed our conversation. I'm really proud of this one, and I'm also loving the Trey Crowder conversation, which comes up after. That's what I've got for you on today's podcast. Ladies and gentlemen, Andrea Chalupa. We're very excited to have Andrea Chalupa joining me solo. She joined Sarah Kendzior one time. They, of course, the co-hosts of Gaslit Nation, which I just told you about. Andrea, thank you very much for talking to me about Ukraine.
I'm honored to be here. Thank you so much.
And for talking to me about you and your kind of origin story, because it's fascinating. You've written a book, of course, the screenplay, both of which I just mentioned, told people a little bit about. But your parents were both born in refugee camps. Can you just give us a little bit about their origin story? Because it's really important and fascinating, I think, to what we're talking about now.
Yeah, absolutely. So my mother's family comes from East Ukraine, from Donbass, which is the region that Putin is currently invading. We still have family there, and we've been following all the hell of Putin's invasion of Ukraine through them, of course, through press reports, through friends in Ukraine. My father's family is from West Ukraine, which is a very different part of the country. The Ukraine is basically split between East and West, and that's significant because the eastern part suffered the worst mass death under Stalin's genocide famine in Ukraine. And that's the subject of my film, Mr. Jones. That's what inspired me to make the film. And the reason why Eastern Ukraine is so ethnically Russian today and Russian speaking, which Putin uses to justify his ongoing invasion of Eastern Ukraine, is because Stalin came in and starved so many Ukrainians, native speaking Ukrainians, ethnic Ukrainians. And then over time, the Kremlin brought in Russians to redevelop the area and so forth. So Putin, in many ways, is building off of Stalin's genocidal legacy in colonizing Ukraine, and those stories of horror that I learned growing up shaped all my career choices. I did a very big gamble out of college. I decided to study at the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. I then moved to Ukraine in 2005. I lived in Kiev for several months. I decided to dedicate years researching, writing about a part of the world that was largely overlooked and misunderstood. A lot of the Western journalists we depend on to explain to us what's going on, they come to Ukraine through a Russian lens. They either studied political science or Soviet history in school, and that was a very Moscow-focused area of research. The best academics of the last 50 years or so during the Cold War that would get access to the Soviet Union to advance their research, to try to advance Western understanding of that part of the world, they were given that access for being friendly to the Kremlin and their sympathies and their point of view. And that then translated into setting up generations of understanding of Ukraine through a Russian lens. I've worked really hard and oftentimes feeling very isolated, especially when starting out, and trying to decolonize the Western understanding of Ukraine by giving Ukrainians back their agency, by trying to explain Ukraine through a Ukrainian lens and not treating Ukraine as some Henry Kissinger chess piece on the chessboard of foreign affairs. One way I did that, as I mentioned, was my film Mr. Jones, which is significant for being one of the very few, I would say, the very few mainstream movies ever made about this little unknown chapter in Soviet history. Stalin's genocide famine in Ukraine is considered the worst genocide out of the several genocides Stalin committed. And we tell that story through a real life, independent Welsh journalist, a young kid who had ideals and ambition and sacrificed his life and career to try to expose what was really going on behind the Iron Curtain. And it's a real story. The story of Garrett Jones is a real story. And we dramatize it in the film and the impact it had and how today it remains a rare, important, independent record behind the Soviet propaganda smokescreen and the useful Western idiots, the media and big business that covered it up, because they're all profiting in their own way from furthering the Kremlin's interests.
Right. Oh, God. I mean, I would love to just talk to you about the film for a long time, but just one question I think is I kind of wanted to know, and maybe you've talked about this, I just couldn't find it preparing to interview you today. How do you go from screenplay to production in a major Hollywood film, stars, everything? Is legit big movie available everywhere now, streaming. Is that an interesting story? I mean, do you know people in entertainment? Like, how do you get that screenplay produced? And then was there any kind of resistance or concern, politically, as it was in the works? Anybody try to stand in the way or prevent it from being produced?
Well, I think just on the face of it, it's not a blockbuster film. It's a film about a genocide. Those are generally difficult to make. And it's a historical film, which historical period films are more expensive. You have to spend a lot more money on costumes and sets and paying attention to all those little details to recreate that time and place. I was not born into a family that had any Hollywood connections whatsoever. My parents were Ukrainian immigrants that grew up, as you mentioned, were born in refugee camps, came to New York City, grew up poor in Alphabet City in the South Bronx and Queens. They had to fight for every little scrap they had. No one could give them anything. And so for me, as their daughter, to not pay them back for all their sacrifices by becoming the president of the United States, it was a very big betrayal, I think, of my family initially, to freak them all out by trying to become a writer. I think they were just like, but what about a job? And so I did work a lot of temp jobs to try to please them. Like, look at all this money. I'm making $15 an hour to sit at this desk and work on my screenplay. But that wasn't enough. I had to, so it was a lot of pressure from the immigrant parents. And I had to figure all that out on my own. And it's a deeply misogynistic industry. And I was, the big lucky break I had, which was being in the right place at the right time, which was I went to a Cody Chestnut concert at Sounds of Brazil in the East, in New York City when I first started living there. And I was standing next to a guy who was scribbling notes in his notepad. And I was like, "Are you a writer? I want to be a writer." And that guy turned out to be Nelson George, the writer of the hip hop movement, who discovered Chris Rock and was like early on investing in Spike Lee's first film, which launched the independent film movement in America, and he just became a historian of Black cultural renaissances in America. And Nelson did what he could for me in trying to open up doors, but that never worked. But what Nelson ultimately did for me was take me seriously as a writer, which every good mentor should do, is show you how to take yourself seriously as a writer, as an artist. And he was the first to do that. And I learned a lot about craft from him. The doors he opened up for me were really too big for me at the time. But he said something to me that I never forgot. He said, he printed out a study, I think from UCLA, showing how white and male Hollywood was. And he handed it to me and he said, "Go get yourself a white man." And that's what I did. I found a white man to help me produce my film. I full on raised money to fly that white man out to a financing meeting where the white man just sat there while I did all the work pitching my project and securing the funding. And it worked. So what I'm saying is that I had to learn how to hustle and break into a system that didn't want me. And I did it through with the help of women already in the industry and non-white men in the industry and some sympathetic, strong white male allies. I really went in defensively, like guerrilla warfare style. Like, I know you don't want me. I know I'm going to get overlooked, but I'm going to get this movie made. And it was years of hell, years of self-doubt, years of peeling myself off the floor. But what I advise to everyone is, if you take on an impossible task like that, ground yourself in why you're doing it. So as dark as things would get, I would always think of my grandfather suffering through the hell of the Soviet Union. And I would just want to reach back in time to him, to say things to him, to comfort him. I just wanted to bring justice to all those nameless people, like give names back to the nameless. And I think a big turning point for me came in 2015 when I was ready to give up on the project. I had friends in media who I started out with who were like going past me in their careers, becoming editors of fancy magazines. And I was still struggling to pull together freelance jobs. So I was feeling really humiliated and pathetic. And it's not fun as a kid of immigrants, to disappoint your parents or feel like you are. And I was almost done in 2015. And then a group of Russian friends in New York reached out to me to join them at a big solidarity march with Boris Nemtsov's anti-war march across Russia. Boris Nemtsov was a handsome, charismatic Russian opposition leader who was an honorary Ukrainian. He would bring Russians and Ukrainians together. He would give speeches in the heart of Kiev saying, "Crimea is Ukraine. We have to give Crimea back." And of course, because he was so powerful and inspiring and united Russians and Ukrainians, the Kremlin had to kill him. So our big solidarity march with Boris Nemtsov's big nationwide anti-war march against Putin's war, days before we were supposed to do that here in New York City, Boris Nemtsov was murdered in the shadow of the Kremlin. And I showed up to that march and I saw the mourning, the lack of hope in my friend's eyes from Russia, and the heartbreak. And I just thought, I can't give up on this film. And I did practically a brand new draft that was an angry draft of Mr. Jones that grabbed the reader by the throat and said, "How dare you not care about what's going on right now over there? History is repeating." And I gave that angry draft of the script to Agnieszka Holland, whose email I happened to have through a mutual friend. I was told to not give my hopes up, that Agnieszka Holland was passing on incredible scripts, big names attached. I shouldn't count on her. She got back to me right away and said, "We're doing this." And she's brainstorming how we're going to put it together. It turns out Agnieszka Holland was just as angry as I was. She grew up in Russia-occupied Poland. We call it the Soviet Union, but it's really the Russian Empire. So you could say Soviet-occupied Poland is really Russia-occupied Poland. And Agnieszka Holland's parents were both journalists, and her father's official cause of death was suicide while under police interrogation. So she had a lot to say with this film, as much as I did. And so that's how the whole project came together. She fought. And when some big money folks tried to get me fired from my own project because they wanted me to water down the script, make it more Hollywood friendly, more just watered down. They wanted us to get rid of a lot of dangerous portions of the script, namely the Ukraine sequence, which is a terror, nightmare, horror story sequence. They wanted that gone.
Wow.
And they saw me as standing in the way of that. And they would dangle millions of euros in front of us if only they could just fire Andrea, the screenwriter. And Agnieszka both times said, no, go fuck yourselves. And we made the film with total freedom. We had a brilliant angel investor save us in the final hour. And I think we were saved by all these ideal conditions, sort of like a hand of God coming in the final hour and just pulling it all together for us. Because I think all of us on that project started off with the right intentions, with pure intentions of fighting for truth, fighting for justice, fighting for healing. And once you have set those good intentions at the start of your journey, you become unstoppable. Your faith will always guide you and protect you. And that's what that experience was like. And the critics that came out on the film, no matter what they thought of the film overall, they all loved the Ukraine sequence. That the part that all the investors wanted gone. We were vindicated ultimately.
Oh my gosh, that's a fascinating story. And now I'm so glad I asked. Mr. Jones is available. I'm seeing it come up on Hulu, but I feel like it's available on Netflix too.
It's on Hulu and iTunes and Amazon and cable on demand and all over.
You can get it.
It's all over the country. It's all over the world.
You can get it everywhere. Google, Apple, Amazon, YouTube. Well, I mean, congratulations on your. I guess your perseverance is the one. If I were to say one thing, and not giving up in the face of. I had no idea that it was such a long journey and there was such that story behind it. But I'm so glad to hear you tell it. What did your parents think of the fact that this film actually got made?
Well, to my mother's credit, in 2015, when I wanted to give up, she popped up and was like, "Oh, don't you dare! You put all this time in." And the fact that she really turned around when I needed her to made a big impact. My dad has no problem saying, "I didn't believe in you for a second." My dad has no problem. He's a New Yorker. They're very and so he was they're all proud now. The New York Times gave it an amazing review and made it a critic's pick. And when that came out, my dad just sat there for days emailing it individually to hundreds of people he probably doesn't even talk to anymore.
Can I just ask you, that just brought up one question, and I do ask this a lot because I do have a book idea that I want to write, Raising Two Daughters. I have this idea I've been working on for a long time about how to help men, raise confident, independent young women.
That.
And so my direction of doing it is not writing it from my point of view, but asking women like you who have a sister like yours about, what your parents did right or wrong, specifically like the man, the male figure, the father figure. Is there anything that you would want to reveal on my podcast about like what your dad, what kind of guy he was how come you and your sister have become such brilliant, independent, strong, powerful adult women? Is it anything to do with parenting?
Well, I think the joke is that if my sister and I could survive our parents, we could survive the Kremlin. Our parents were very tough. They're very tough. They had it tough. They had it extremely tough.
Yeah.
And so they were tough. But I think what my father did specifically that made a huge impact on me, which I appreciate so much, especially now as an adult, is two things. The first one was he never shied away, no matter how old I was, to exposing me to culture. And so I grew up watching a lot of films that probably I wasn't old enough to watch, but watching my parents appreciate those films gave me an appreciation for those films. He would take me to museums. He would take me. My dad's a neuroscientist. He's in academia, so that means a lot of conferences abroad in Europe with his research partners. So he introduced me to the world, to Europe. And if you can't take your kids to Europe, you can take them wherever you live, to cultural centers wherever you live. So I think my parents were very. They wanted to consume all this interesting culture, and so they took us along for that ride, whether we were old enough or not to. So they didn't dumb us down, basically. So I always felt a lot more sophisticated as a kid. I always had a greater appreciation for the world beyond myself, and I also loved difficult, challenging movies. Like at 11 years old, my mom took me to see Schindler's List. And the friend that was with me was turning around during the nudes, when the naked people are forced out of the ghetto. Anytime there's any nudity in Schindler's List, my friend was like cringing. She was like, "How dare we can't watch this?" I was watching nudity in films for years as a kid because of all the challenging stuff my parents were showing me, and a lot of that material. Oh dear Lord, my mom was reading me Percy Shelley and Lord Byron and Fitzgerald and Hemingway. And The Sun Also Rises when I was like in second grade.
Wow.
So they gave me a lot of adult stuff from a very young age. And I think that more than anything solidified for me that I could go off and make a very challenging European film. I didn't want to make something pop. I didn't want to make something more mainstream. I wanted to make the type of challenging cultural stuff that my parents exposed me to when I was very young and that I grew up with.
Wow, I love that. Thank you. Thank you
that made a big impact. So don't dumb down your kids or segregate your kids in kid culture. Expose them to a lot of exciting, interesting culture, whether you think they're old enough for it or not.
Yeah, too late. So thank you, though. For other parents, no, I think that's great advice. I like to think that we've done as much as we can, but I love the idea of also, if you can't travel to Europe or travel to, experience different cultures, there's all kinds of different cultural centers that you can take your kids to, and at every age, that certainly matters. So let's get to Ukraine, and quickly, why do people call it the Ukraine, and why is that offensive or annoying?
Well, Ukraine, as I mentioned, is overlooked and misunderstood. And I first want to get to what Ukraine is.
Yeah.
Ukraine is a very large and resource-rich country, geographically blessed, being on the Black Sea, being in the heart of Europe, being the breadbasket of Europe. It's an agricultural Black Earth country where it's really easy to grow things. Culturally, Ukraine is the site of an ancient Byzantium empire back in the year 1000, 800, 900, 1000 that would marry princesses across Europe. One of the princesses was Anne of Kiev, who, when she married into the dirty, illiterate France, she would write letters home to her father in Kiev saying, like, the Franks are heathens, they don't bathe, they don't eat the customary 12 meals at dinner that I'm used to. And her husband died early in the marriage, leaving her to run France.
Oh, wow.
And she did that. And her immediate descendants would go on to start the Louvre and really turned France around. She would earn the respect and admiration of the Pope of the day. And she held her own. And she really brought France together culturally. And all the French kings that came after her would swear would be sworn in as kings or whatever they were called. They'd do their coronations with her Bible from Kiev, an old church Slavonic included.
Oh, interesting.
So it's important to know that Ukraine has an extraordinarily ancient, proud history and culture. And Kiev is considered the Jerusalem of the Slavs. And Ukrainian culture history is centuries older than even the existence of Moscow. Moscow was some far-flung nothing outpost for centuries, while Kiev was this bustling, internationally known at the time kingdom, with high literacy rates and high, relatively good laws for women. So that's important for people to start with, because they think like, what is this? What?
Yeah.
And so the with the Ukraine is basically makes Ukraine framed as a region, like the Caucasus. It's just a region. And the reality is it's much bigger than that and on so many ways. And as the saying goes in foreign policy, Russia, which hijacked and appropriated a lot of Ukraine's history for itself. For instance, the ancient kingdom that I've mentioned was called Kiev Rus. Russia took Rus for its own name. Russia, Rus, that's where that came from. Before it was Muscovy. And then they decided to appropriate Ukraine's history to try to give it greater might and significance. And then they became Russia. And even to this day, Putin tries to claim Kiev Rus as Russian history and tries to say that Ukraine it doesn't exist. It doesn't have a right to autonomy. Right. It's nothing. It's an extension of Russia, which is simply not true. Ukraine has its own language, its own proud history, and that is what has sustained it through centuries of Russian colonialism and oppression and genocide. So if you're wondering why Ukraine is miraculously hanging on for this long, it's because it has a lot of pride in itself, a strong sense of national identity. And that spirit has lived on through a lot of Ukraine's leading artists, past and present. When there was the revolution that drove a popular uprising that drove Putin's puppet, the Trump of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych. This guy was like grossly corrupt, right? Stole tens of billions of dollars from the state, built himself a massive sprawling McMansion, Versailles, with its own private zoo and golf course.
Yeah, I
and
mean
shit.
the world got to see all that after he abandoned it. It was pretty.
People like, oh, that's why they had a revolution. So when all of these people from all walks of life across Ukraine joined together, a very diverse, loose, organic coalition, this popular uprising, they on the square in the bitter cold for months were holding up signs, for instance, of some of Ukraine's Walt Whitman. Taras Shevchenko, like a lot of Ukraine leading poets. They had murals to those guys painted there because Ukraine's artists over centuries have kept the idea of Ukraine's national spirit alive. But the national artists were seen as freedom fighters, saying, giving the people back their dignity. So Ukraine has had a very strong resistance culture, literally in the arts, especially. And a lot of Ukraine's artists, especially under Soviet rule, were tortured, arrested, lynched. Horrible stuff happened to them just for writing songs in Ukrainian, writing poems in Ukrainian, speaking Ukrainian. And so Russia has really worked to try to colonize and stamp out all of that. But it's been extremely hard because Ukraine's own history and cultural pride goes very, very deep.
So, wow, that's a great background on the history of the country. I'm so glad that you agreed to talk to me. I'm really enjoying learning and hearing your perspective, and you're great at presenting it, of course, as Gaslit Nation listeners know. So do we have time to set the stage?
Yeah.
Okay, because I know I didn't. Anyway, let's get to it, because I want to understand your perspective. And then also, at some point within an answer here, you can talk about what media outlets you think are reporting accurately or, through a Ukrainian lens. I think you earlier mentioned Western journalists often reporting through a Russian lens. So, you've got your family still there. You are a source in many ways of what's going on there because of the sources that you have there still there. But we need national media outlets. We need corporate media. We need independent media. We need as accurate and as good reporting from the Ukrainian lens and viewpoint that we can get. So what's happening right now? How concerned are you about what is happening right now?
I'm very concerned because Putin's Russia is falling apart. There's a pandemic. The numbers of deaths are much higher than are being reported. The terror against the internal repression and terror across Russia against human rights activists and their families and friends, against any organization that presents any alternative inside Russia to Putin, is being terrorized. The sadism, the terrorism is ramping up against these people. A lot of these groups, if they haven't already, they're being labeled foreign groups. Foreign groups open themselves up to all sorts of harassment. What's really important to understand is that they don't stop at the activist. They go after the activist's family and inner circle. And what this means is that it's hard for those people who have their homes violently searched. They lose access to any sort of funding, especially outside funding. They can't get jobs. They put their lives on the line anytime they choose to expose any corruption and expose what's being done to them. These laws are becoming increasingly autocratic, and the poverty rate is skyrocketing. Corruption is rampant and unchecked, including in this military, right? Including in this military. And so Russia internally is falling apart. I think that's really important for people to understand. There's been a brain drain there for many years. The currency is being hurt. So Putin is keeping Russia as a prison and using the Soviet style rule. And just like during the end of the Soviet period, regular people across society are suffering. So the discontent against Russia is far greater than we could be made aware of, because so many people are forced underground, and so many of these wonderful opposition leaders and their families are being forced into exile. I was recently part of and so that's important to understand, because everyone looks at big bad Putin with his bare chest, his big military. It's a house of cards. In so many ways, Russia today is a house of cards. And Putin knows that. So he needs a war in order to distract from the disaster that is Putinism. He needs a war. And the war with Ukraine is not popular internally because you have a lot of mixed family and mixed friends that are Russian and Ukrainian. So it's a fraternal war. And so there have been many impressive anti-war marches. Boris Nemtsov sacrificed his life to expose Putin's invasion of Ukraine. So there is a lot of natural solidarity there between Russians and Ukrainians. That's important to understand. And a lot of my work has been supported by Russians who are forced to live abroad. And so the military, even though it's a massive military and massively funded, they're suffering under COVID and they're suffering from corruption. And so I think Putin needs his war with Ukraine. Putin needs his war with Ukraine in order to distract from what's going on at home. And so that's really scary. He's a corner dog, and corner dogs are dangerous. And so the other thing that's also scary is that Putin had this plan to make this is important for people to know. This is important for people to know, to sort of the background of what's going on and why we're here. Putin had a plan to create the Eurasian Union, which is going to be a counter to the European Union. And the jewel in the crown of the Eurasian Union was supposed to be Ukraine. Well, he lost Ukraine to a popular uprising. And Ukraine is doing a million times better now than Russia. They have a charismatic, he's not perfect by any means. It's not, he's got his big politician faults by a mile, but he's compared to Russia, Ukraine has a charismatic Russian speaking comedian that knows how to clap back. And his speeches are heard across the region, showing this post-Soviet region an alternative to Kremlin rule. That's incredibly dangerous.
That makes me interested to watch one of Zelensky's speeches. Where can we watch them? In is there a English translation that would be interesting or to watch?
He did. I can send you a video that he did marking Ukraine's Independence Day, which was incredibly moving, and he's actually tearing up in the video. And
yeah, I'd like to see that. But also, could you just real quick, Andrea, underscore the Ukrainian Revolution? You just touched on it quickly twice. Popular revolt. I know you want to give more credit to what happened, because it was basically, the world watched that happen. It was a few years ago,
right.
And it was basically Ukrainians who wanted to be more aligned with a certain, let's just say non-Russian, or I always heard it called Western culture, versus Russian culture, and a minority of ethnic and Russian-speaking people, and they won, and it was they were in the streets in the freezing for how long? And wanted to just get one or two thoughts on what happened and why it mattered and who was in those streets.
Right. So Ukraine's popular uprising of 2013, 2014 was an internet revolution. It was the internet generation of Ukrainian kids who grew up with the internet and watching how the rest of the world lived, especially in the nearby European Union, where they watched kids their age consuming all types of culture freely, living free, relatively free of corruption, and advancing their lot in life, going to college, getting good jobs and cars, and they wanted that for themselves. And the alternative, which was Russia, which is a dying country. And so that's really where it came from. It was the internet generation that launched the revolution in Ukraine. Like literally, it was launched with a Facebook post. And the whole nucleus of the revolution was a ragtag group of young, independent journalists in Ukraine who had quit their big corporate media jobs en masse due to government censorship and started their own online television network. And they built this themselves.
Was it pro-Russian censorship?
It was just government censorship. So it was the government at the time was under Putin's puppet.
Right.
Russian. So the major oligarch-owned media across Ukraine was very much, aligned with whoever is going to the power sources of the day. So, but it's important to understand that this revolution was against corruption, and Putin's Kremlin represents corruption. And they wanted to go with the EU. They wanted to live like the European Union. And what set it off, the match that dropped into the growing pool of gasoline was Putin's puppet, Viktor Yanukovych, the Trump of Ukraine. He ran for office all polished and gaslighting the electorate. He was managed by Paul Manafort, who would go on to manage Trump's campaign. And Paul Manafort told him how to dress, told him how to present himself, told him what to say. And he came to power promising Ukrainians, don't worry, we're going to join the European Union, but we're going to establish closer ties to the European Union, but we're going to do it on our terms, like Trump, like tough Trumpian language. And that convinced people. So he was voted in. And what did he do in very Trumpian style? He refused to sign the long-anticipated, long-awaited, exciting big moment of signing the European Association Agreement, bringing Ukraine closer with the EU. And instead, he took something like a $20 billion bribe, a $20 billion bailout from the Kremlin. And that was it. The people had enough. And so this one non-white Ukrainian, this guy by the name of Mustafa Nayyem, who's born in Afghanistan, he's a non-white Ukrainian, and he launched this Facebook post saying, enough is enough. Let's all meet at the square. I'll see you guys there. And that's what started it.
Wow.
And it was all young people at first. It was college students. And the more violence that Putin's puppet, the Trumpian Ukraine, inflicted on these young protesters, the more it pissed off the mothers and the fathers across Ukraine. And so everyone started showing up on the square. And it became this big art festival with people creating a lending library, bands coming out. I have two friends who are musicians that met during the revolution, met and fell in love. And then they created a musical about the revolution that went on to win awards.
Wow.
And so it became, so the way Ukrainians were able to live out in the freezing cold for months and facing off with police terror, government snipers, is because they refused to submit to a Russian future. They wanted to have a European Union future. And they sustained themselves with that conviction in the cold. And also they turned it into an art festival. They had a lot of creativity out there in the square. So that's important for anybody doing protest resistance movements to understand, is that the arts and culture, that's an important ingredient to sustaining any movement, and people should embrace that creativity more.
And not only that, activism can be really fun because you meet amazing people and do amazing things with them. I think people think about it as burdensome or responsibility or really challenging, but you can meet and fall in love.
Right, exactly.
So, I mean, when you give us all that texture and background as you have for almost an hour now, I mean, it makes me care so much more about the people there, especially the young people who fought to get where they are at now. And to imagine that there is a bloody war on the precipice, and some of those people will surely lose their lives, and all for Putin to maintain power, really, because there's no groundswell in the Russian public seemingly to support this, which is why they might need some kind of false flag operation, some kind of impetus for it to create support for it. I mean, he is in as you painted, a tough spot without this conflict. So I don't know. I guess I want to ask here at the end, like, however you want to say you see it going. And then I think it matters to talk about the role of the West, of NATO, and then specifically the players who have interests and the hypocrisies there and their interests, like Germany. I saw you writing about, where they are selling and sending weapons and where they aren't.
Right. So I think it's important to understand what's going on in Ukraine and the stakes there from a Ukrainian perspective, giving Ukraine agency. And I want to go back, before I touch on the war, I want to go back to the revolution. Kremlin propaganda was extraordinarily effective in convincing a lot of people in the West that Ukraine's popular uprising was a CIA coup, was a fascist uprising. That's all Kremlin propaganda. And it worked really well. It got into RT and it got into a lot of leftist media and right-wing media. And the reality is that the West did not want this problem. And European officials even came in to broker a peace deal between Putin's puppet and the revolution. And the compromise was that Putin's puppet could stay in power. Everyone would go home. There'd be no more bloody battles in the streets of Kiev. And in exchange, they would get new elections. And when this was announced on the stage at the revolution before a sea of people, a young kid who's in his 20s, a young kid breaks through the crowd, climbs up on stage, grabs the microphone, and says out to the crowd, "I watched my best friend killed by government snipers." Or he told some horrific story of losing someone he loved during the revolution. And he said, "The president has until tomorrow morning to leave, or we're going to force him to leave," and dropped the mic and got off stage. It was like one of the most consequential mic drops in history. And what happened? In the middle of the night, Yanukovych fled. He fled to Russia. And the next day, the people took over his Versailles McMansion and peacefully toured the grounds to see what he did with all their stolen money. And then they had new elections, and they ushered in a overwhelmingly pro-Western democratic government. So that's really important to understand. And why that's important to understand is because the West does not want this headache of Ukraine at all. Germany, a leader of the EU, has extremely close cultural ties to Russia. A big chunk of Germany was under Russian occupation, right? East Germany. Right. They were forced to speak Russian there. The collapse of the Soviet Union meant massive poverty, unimaginable poverty across a sizable portion of Germany, which was a major humiliation for so many people to live in such abject poverty. And as much as the Kremlin's own policies are to blame for that, a lot of the blame was put on the gleeful West for its victory over the East. And so there are very close cultural ties with Germany and Russia. And on top of that, you have a Trumpian German by the name of Gerhard Schroeder, who was the former chancellor, who is very much, he's a posh Trump. He's very much in the pocket of Putin. He's a walking, talking Putin propagandist. He calls any criticism of Putin Russophobic, anti-Russian. Right. And what he did in his final days as Chancellor of Germany, when he was essentially voted out and lost power, is he greenlit a Russian geopolitical weapon financially supported by the German government, which is significant for people to understand on so many levels. What he did was he greenlit Nord Stream 2, which the whole Nord Stream project, which is very wonky, but it matters so much, and it's going to explain so much of what Biden is doing now and what the EU is doing now. That's
natural gas pipeline.
Yes. So what he did was he greenlit a gas pipeline between Russia and Germany, which cut out the pipeline traveling through Ukraine, depriving Ukraine of much needed transit revenue. And on top of that, it further entrenched Germany's dependence on Russian gas, which Germany currently weaponizes. Germany is currently turning off a lot of, is depriving Germany of.
Russia is depriving Germany.
Russia is depriving Germany of gas currently, shrinking the volume of gas they're delivering, which is driving up gas prices in Europe. And they're doing this to try to pressure their way with this whole Ukraine situation.
Right.
And this whole project, Nord Stream 2, is ran by Putin's old Stasi buddy, Stasi being the German KGB during, in East Berlin. So the whole project is ran by Putin's old Stasi buddy from Putin's KGB days in East Berlin. It's a geopolitical weapon meant to essentially blackmail Germany into submission. And Germany has no problem with it because they're making money off of it by building the pipeline. They've got European companies building this pipeline with Russian companies. And plus, Gerhard Schroeder is seen as a normal guy inside Germany. He's not seen as a Trump. He's not seen as Putin's puppet because I think of Germany's long cultural history and close ties with Russia. So there you have it. And so that all matters because Biden's hands, just like Obama's, are tied to an extent on how far he can go. The U.S. does not want to pull a George W. Bush and push this through like Bush did with the Iraq war and Afghanistan. They want to make sure that the U.S. is coming across as a global player and that they're doing everything like Europe likes to do it. Europe loves consensus building. So the U.S. isn't going to steamroll the EU into doing all of these aggressive, urgently needed sanctions against Russia to try to stop Putin before he has a chance to invade. So Biden's hands are tied to an extent when it comes to the EU because of Germany. And so that's creating a divide.
Just real quick, you mentioned Obama's hands are tied. You're talking about during the Obama administration, the invasion, annexation of Crimea. He was in a similar situation with the geopolitical chess game that you're laying out and competing interests and why he could or couldn't do things and consensus building, et cetera. And now Biden is in a similar situation. And the one specific question I knew I wanted to ask you, because it's certainly been, I don't want to only say a right-wing talking point. It's an interesting question, I suppose. It's a fair question. If Trump was in Putin's pocket or influenced by Putin, why wouldn't Putin have invaded Ukraine then, as opposed to a more adversarial President Biden?
That's a really good question. Why is he doing it? Why now? I think because ultimately he doesn't want to do it. It's not popular domestically. Dead Russian soldiers radicalize their wives and families back home. You had mothers and wives and family members of dead Russian soldiers killed in Ukraine, risking their own lives and freedom to expose Putin's aggression in Ukraine. It's not a popular war. And these soldiers and the veterans are not being treated well. So there are costs to Putin domestically. So I think during the Trump years, he was satisfied. He got a lot. He got a lot during the Trump years. And I think he's doing it now because he's scared. By invading Ukraine, by escalating Putin's invasion of Ukraine, because he's been invading since 2014. By escalating his invasion, what he's doing is holding a gun to the head of not just Ukrainians, but President Biden, saying, you better not hold me accountable. You better not be tough on me, or I will go after Ukraine. Because the reality is this whole thing where Putin is like, I'm going to invade Ukraine unless you say out loud that you will not allow Ukraine to join NATO. None of these European players want Ukraine to join NATO. Again, Europe does not want this headache. And so that's a non-issue. Ukraine joining NATO anytime soon is a non-issue. And so what Putin's really doing is, okay, so I've got these people that I've been terrorizing for years, right? He's been terrorizing the Democrats for years. What he did in 2016 was an act of war against the Democratic National Committee. Agreed. And in the years leading up to the 2020 election, right, the Russians were under Putin were hacking American hospitals during the crisis of our pandemic, they did that cyber Pearl Harbor called the Solar Winds hack that caused massive destruction and chaos. They were being ruthless towards us. Like they had declared war on us, and they were acting this out in all sorts of aggressive, destructive ways. And then suddenly, the victims, this political party that represents the majority of Americans that felt the terror of Kremlin aggression for so long, suddenly comes to power. And one of the first things President Biden does is declare Kremlin aggression a national emergency. So Putin is really saying, okay, like, I need to contain you, Biden, from holding me accountable.
Right.
And so that's really why he's being so belligerent right now. He really does not want this war. War is chaotic. War is messy. Domestically, it's going to make things harder for him.
I'm so sorry to interrupt you. I just want to interpret what you're saying, because it sounds like, based on what you've said and what little I've read about the dynamics, the power dynamics and politics in Russia, he's been weakened by both the economy because of gas prices and, as you just said, the pandemic. It's far worse, most likely, than it's being reported, which is probably true of most places, including our own. And he's desperate to maintain power. He has an election in 2024. This is a desperate and dangerous attempt that has a lot to do with the timing and the circumstances that you mentioned, and maybe to some extent less to do with whoever's in charge in America. And furthermore, he was doing well under Trump, which would illustrate even more so why he has to flex his shitty granddad bod under Biden.
Yeah. So in terms of an election for Putin arranged it so he can die in power. He had the Russian constitution changed, so like any dictator, he could die in power. Putin can't step down. Even if he's exhausted from all this, he can't step down, because as soon as he loses power, he's going to get car bombed somewhere. And, so he's basically like any dictator who's amassed all these enemies over the years and stolen oligarchs' fortunes and had it liquidated or had them sent abroad or harassed their families. He's stuck dying in power. And so he arranged that for himself with changes to the Constitution. So what he's literally trying to do right now is bring back the Russian Empire, aka the Soviet Union. He's got this deal with Belarus that Russia's going to literally absorb Belarus politically and become one nation. He has that deal. He is the dictator of Belarus is facing his own internal crisis with the people rising up against him.
Yeah.
And so the dictator of Belarus for a very long time was sort of trying to push Putin off and saying, no, actually, I like being my own little fiefdom. I don't want to absorb with you. I like being the king of my castle. But then as soon as he got scared of the people of Belarus rising up against him, he had to run to Big Daddy Putin for protection. And Putin's been sending his agents in, his propagandists in to crush the uprising in Belarus brutally. And now Putin is using Belarus as a staging ground to potentially launch another front in his invasion of Ukraine. And so the idea is that Putin is going to absorb Belarus, just like they had a deal they would do this. And on a multi-front effort, he could invade Ukraine, bite off a big chunk of Ukraine, absorb it, give whatever he gets of Ukraine in the coming year. He could call it its own country and just keep it as a hot conflict, a frozen conflict, and just chip off more and more of Ukraine over the years until he dies. And by doing so, what he will ultimately get, which is what he wants, is, as I mentioned at the start of the discussion, he wants his Eurasian Union. He wants to establish a Soviet Union. He wants to establish a Russian Empire, and that he sees as bringing back Russian might. Putin famously called the collapse of the Soviet Union one of the great tragedies.
Right.
He was very much forged from the KGB,
right.
And he wants to bring that all back, the Russian Empire, the Russian world. Ukraine does not want that. Ukraine is showing that region an alternative to that, which is what makes Ukraine so dangerous, which is why Ukraine must fail as a state, which is why Ukraine is getting terrorized. And so that's where we are.
Is there anything that the U.S. can or should be doing? There's a lot of really interesting discussions and arguments. Unfortunately, many of them are being led by the same old hacks. But what are your thoughts here at the end about the U.S. role and what the United States, what our public, our citizens, how we should see this? Which is why I'm so glad that I got to talk to you to hear your perspective and share it with folks. But how should we be thinking?
Well, I think, first of all, no one wants war. Ukrainians do not want war.
Right.
The Russian people do not want war. Europeans sure as hell do not want war, because if war erupts, if the war escalates in Ukraine, it's going to worsen a refugee crisis, which is going to further strain the European Union, which is going to further, which is going to further inflame far-right Trumpian anti-immigration parties across Europe, which are propped up many financially and certainly through propaganda by the Kremlin. And that's going to further politically divide Europe. So war in Ukraine, an escalating war in Ukraine, will seriously destabilize the EU over the coming years. No one wants war. War is hell. War is evil. No one wants war. But what the U.S. must do is, the U.S. is much tougher on Kremlin aggression than the EU. There are Russian oligarchs that are allowed in the UK that are not allowed in the US. That has been a rule. Like Deripaska's one. And Deripaska, a close associate of Manafort's and Putin's. And so I think what's really important is for the US to speak with action, right? And to back up a lot of Biden's statements and plans in his first year, calling Kremlin aggression a national emergency, calling for a boosting of national security, including greater communication by all law enforcement, and countering corruption as a weapon that Putin leverages against us, right? So you have the Republicans embracing Deripaska, right? Deripaska, one of Putin's oligarch lieutenants, Manafort's guy, trying to set up shop in Mitch McConnell's Kentucky. That should never have been allowed to happen, should not be allowed to happen. So it's those sort of things, like cleaning up our own corruption, refusing to allow the Kremlin's oligarchs to use any American politician, banning Russian propaganda outlets in the U.S., turning off that tap because it's all hate speech. And genocides and wars begin with hate speech. There are plenty of Russian opposition organizers who would love funding and security guarantees and immigration support from the U.S. government, because they're forced to live abroad, flee abroad, leave everything behind. That's a terrifying situation. When I've talked to Russian activists, like, what do you want? What do you want from Biden? They say, keep us alive. Keep us alive. And they say, we're the ones fighting and risking our lives for an alternative to Putin. Help us. Keep us alive. Give us security guarantees, immigration support, and fund us. These are people doing independent media, independent investigations, exposing corruption, exposing environmental abuses. Russia has a wonderful group of activists focusing on environmental issues across Russia. Keep those people alive, empower them. They're the ones working tirelessly for an alternative to Putin. They're keeping that flame of Russian democracy alive, and they're forced to live abroad in countries like ours. Support those folks. And the other thing the U.S. should not be afraid to do, the EU is always going to be behind us in terms of what we do to counter Kremlin aggression. The U.S. should not be afraid to go there, to pass sanctions that really do bite, and not worry about EU buy-in. Don't worry about EU buy-in. As long as you're not going to war, as long as you're not going with a military solution, it's okay to economically confront and contain the Kremlin's aggression and to isolate Putin. No more summits with Putin. Dictators love summits. I believe the summit Biden did with Putin in June was because he had no choice. His hands were tied. I think the U.S. was greatly hobbled in so many ways by Putin's attacks on us, like solar winds, for instance. And I think Biden had no choice but to do that summit with Putin and try to bring down the temperature, to catch our breath for a bit, to sort of put an end temporarily to any sort of attacks, and to give some time for the new administration to regroup. But I think now that they've adjusted, they've come in, no more summits because dictators love that.
Right.
And the final point is take the victims, the hundreds of victims of Havana syndrome seriously. There's a lot of muddled noise in the press and propaganda trying to discredit the victims of Havana syndrome. The fact remains that for decades, the Kremlin experimented with microwaves as a weapon. You have around 200 men and women who served the U.S. in the intelligence community and in diplomacy, many of them focused on countering Kremlin aggression, who all suffered from the same brain damage attacks.
I'm so confused about that. The evidence of it seemed physiological evidence of it, even if I think affecting the dogs or something like that, seemed pretty concrete. Well. And now I feel like I read some credible reporting saying there's no evidence of it or something recently. Where is the best reporting in your mind on that?
Julia Ioffe did a really big breakdown on GQ, which was excellent. I would listen to the victims themselves who are speaking out. And it's The Guardian did a great piece saying, confirming yes, microwave weapons.
I'll read Julia's piece. I love and know Julia. I'll definitely reach out to her too. Okay. Well, listen, I mean, you said, I can't even tell you. I appreciate it. We've been talking for, I think, over an hour, and I asked for half an hour, and I just could not. I learned so much, and I really appreciate it, and it was a pleasure. And getting to know you a little bit better too was also really cool. And I'm such a big fan of your work, independently and with Sarah at Gaslit Nation. And I hope that we can talk again soon because I have a lot more questions, a lot more to learn.
Thank you so much. I appreciate all this time and giving me a platform to raise all these very important issues. And thanks always for all of it.
All right, looking forward to doing it again. Well, there you go. Andrea Chalupa. Listen to Gaslit Nation. Get her book and watch the movie, Mr. Jones. And I hope to get her back again. Thank you to, who was it? Was it Tina Winsett who suggested I have Andrea on? Who else should I be talking to about Ukraine? I know I want to talk with Bill B. in D.C., who we always love to talk as well. All right, well, now it's time to get to my second guest on the show today. He is a very funny stand-up comedian who has gone viral for years with his rants on YouTube and all the other video apps. You can listen to two of his podcasts. He's got two podcasts, Weekly Skews, which he hosts every week, and that's more political, but then he's also got one that he does with his partners on the Well-Read comedy tour, Well-Read podcast, everybody, which you can listen to him and Corey Forrester and Drew Morgan, and as well as see them on tour. These guys are great guys. I love them. WellReadComedy.com to see all their dates. And Trey Crowder on Twitter. Had a great time catching up with Trey. Always a great guest. And we just shot the shit. We talked about everything. Covered a lot of ground, about half an hour. Very excited to share it with you now. Ladies and gentlemen, Trey Crowder. All right, I've got him on the old video link. He's on the screen. I'm in the shed. He's in, I don't know, California. Trey Crowder, welcome back. Thank you so much for hooking up with me today. Great to see you. You look great.
Oh, thanks, bud. Appreciate it. Yeah, warming the cockles of my heart there. Thank you. Yeah, good to be back.
The cockles.
Mm-hmm.
I love
the heart cockles.
The heart cockles.
That heart cockle talk. Yeah.
How are things, man? How are you doing? We were just before I hit record talking about touring and how it's a really weird time. You booked all these dates.
Yeah.
And you got fans all over the country. You sell a lot of tickets. You guys are kind of like, I think, at your peak. Like, you really have had a lot of success over the past couple of years, even with the pandemic, with all your internet stuff going viral. And yet people, even though they're huge fans, they might not want to come to a show because of COVID. What are you hearing everywhere you go?
I mean, I'm hearing that everywhere I go. My fans are, they're liberals, they're progressives. So they take COVID seriously is what I'm saying. They're not the ones calling it a hoax or that, it's a bunch of bullcrap. They're not doing that, which obviously I respect. But what that also means is, yes, a lot of them are not. I get messages all the time. Love you, but I'm just not really comfortable with that still. And I respect that. I'm not going to trash that. I get it, but it makes it, it's hard. It's difficult, and it's a weird time for sure to be still trying to do shows and everything.
Yeah, I think that to some extent, more progressive-minded people, even if they've been boosted, they're not that worried about getting sick. There's kind of a moral conflict with going out and being a host and spreading it, and kind of feeling like you're not doing your part. You're crossing a line that you agreed not to pass. And at this point, I'm not judging people who are triple vaccinated, and I'm certainly not judging live performers who make their living, and are asking people at least to be vaccinated. So it's hard to judge at this point anybody's view on what they want to do, I guess.
Yeah, no. I mean, when the vaccines first came out, in my head, I was like, all right, you want the vaccine, you could get it, then, we're good to go and go back to living my life. Obviously, it didn't play out exactly that way, all the different variants and stuff. But then I got boosted. And it's like, I'm not worried about myself or any one person either, because the people that come to our shows are going to be 99+%, I think, with maybe some odd outliers, are going to be vaccinated. We require that. They'll be vaccinated, boosted, and all that stuff. But it's like you said, there is this kind of like inner conflict of like, that's just not a thing you're supposed to do right now. Yeah. But obviously with us, it's like, well, that's what we do. We don't want to be irresponsible, but we also want to give people that are cool with it an opportunity to come out and have a good time and everything. And yeah, it's just, I mean, it's a whole thing, man. And I'm, pretty sure do wish it would end, but hey, what are you going to do?
How are the people in your life from home and throughout your life? How much are you hearing and talking to, or maybe arguing and convincing people that you care about that haven't gotten vaccinated? You're traveling all over the country. You come from Tennessee, but I mean, who you hear from, who you talking to in terms of how divisive is this vaccine with people in your life?
I mean, I'm lucky because I'm not really the blue sheep of my family, as it were, which is the case for a lot of people like progressives from the South. But I'm not really. I was raised by a single father. My dad has a gay brother. They were all like lifelong Democrats that like evolved with the party and whatnot. So I was kind of raised to be this way. So my sister, my uncle, my mama, all the people that are left, they're all vaccinated. And then my in-laws, my wife has aunts and uncles and plenty of cousins and stuff who are hardcore that way, but it seems like it's kind of divided her family some, because her immediate family, her parents and sisters and all that, they are also all vaccinated. So we went back to rural Tennessee for Christmas, my hometown and then her hometown, but it's only these people I just mentioned that we're spending time with.
Right.
Everybody's vaccinated, boosted, takes it seriously, and so it's not a problem. But like in my wife's family, the other ones, like we were there for almost 2 weeks and they never came around or anything. And I wonder if it's because they're on that side of this whole deal. Maybe they're not vaccinated and they're not, it's just driven a wedge between them or something, I guess. I don't know. But I personally am not having to have those arguments, which is nice, because if I had someone close to me that I really cared about that I knew just wasn't feeling it for whatever reason, I wouldn't be able to not try to convince them, Sure. And I'm glad I don't have to do that.
Now, do you have a living grandma and you call her Mima? Is that what I just heard?
Yeah.
Yes,
I do.
You as a grown man refer to your grandmother still to her face as you'll say, like, use it in a sentence for me.
Hey, Mima, how you doing, Mima? Where's the beans at, Mima? Like, look, my Mima would be furious if I called her anything but Mima. Okay, like she's always been Mima my whole life, and she's still kicking at 83. Everybody calls her Mima. Like that's just like her title now. Meaning my wife and my sons, they all just call her Mima. Everybody. Do you know
how to spell that? Because my daughters call my mom Mima, but I feel like you have kind of put a little bit more spice on it with a maw.
Well, what's funny about that? So first of all, this is not that uncommon of an occurrence where I'm from. There's a lot of mammas. But there's a fair number of meemaws too.
I love it
and
when you say it.
Just the other day on a group text, one of our friends from back home was saying to my sister, she was saying she thought we misspelled it. And I think she has maybe a point here, because my sister and I, we've always just spelled it M-E-M-A, which that sounds like Mima, or what you just said. Yeah,
that's how we spell M-E-M-A.
I know. Yeah. Right. Well, honestly, what you're doing makes more sense than what we're doing. We just always spelled it that way and still do. I think really, and my sister will get mad if she hears me say this, but whatever. I just think it's the truth. I think if you're being honest with yourself, Mima should probably be spelled like M-E-E-M-A-W, I think. Something like that is how it should be spelled. But hey, I spelled my first name wrong. You know, my family.
That's true too, Trey.
Not good at spelling stuff. Yeah,
Trae. It's really annoying. Every time I typed it in, it's like, Jesus, it keeps throwing me off. Your sister, by the way, one of my biggest fans and listeners, so she's going to be really pissed about what you said. But I think the maw is a lot more. It adds a lot more fun to it. But okay, so what are you surprised? Do you ever think about or see these charts that correlate with unvaccinated people also living in certain parts of the country, more specifically aligning their politics with conservative policies? What could be a more stark, I think, dividing line than that? Are you ever surprised that people who tend to support conservative politicians, politics, and ideas and listen to these media outlets are the unvaccinated overwhelmingly?
I mean, not at this point, just because of the way COVID got politicized and the manner in which it did, and it sort of just fell down on their side of the fence. I mean, I remember thinking that like the general anti-vax thing, when it first started, I remember as a liberal being embarrassed of it, because in my head, I was like, that's like the liberal version of climate change denial. That's what that is. I thought it was like coastal, crunchy ass liberals who weren't getting their kids vaccinated for all the old stuff. Right. So it was like a liberal shame in my head. But then the way COVID played out and the way it got politicized, I'm not surprised that they ended up latching onto that too. But I think you see some weird overlaps now where it's like those other people still exist. Like I still can't really tell what's going on with Aaron Rodgers, like what version of that he is, because they seem pretty crunchy and stuff otherwise. But like, you know what I mean? Like it's confusing now.
Don't you think there's all these political scientists and brilliant academics out there? I interview a lot of them. I think these are brilliant people, but sometimes we overthink what the ideology is. The ideology here, certainly to some on the right, is don't tell me what to do. Nobody tells me what to do. Don't tell me to wear a seatbelt. Don't tell me not to drink and drive. Don't tell me to get a vaccine, even though all those things will save my life. Don't anybody tell me what to do. Certainly not the government. It seems like to water down to just don't tell me what to do. And it's like, I don't want to tell you what to do, but you'll live if you do this and you'll die if you do that. I'm just saying.
Well, I wonder if because when you think back I know that when seatbelt laws were becoming a real thing everywhere, there were a whole lot of people then that were like, this is fascist, or this isn't fascist.
Sure.
Can't force me to wear a seatbelt. That happens with helmet laws and motorcyclists all the time, still to this day. So it's like, maybe it is a kind of natural thing amongst a certain subset of people. But I feel like in those cases, eventually, I don't know if they just give up. They find another car to chase at some point or something, or they just quietly recognize that they see enough of their compatriots die from a thing or something, and they just sort of slowly give up on it. I don't know. It's still not happening yet with the vaccines and whatnot, but it feels like historically it tends to kind of eventually taper off, and that, until another thing pops up. So maybe that'll happen here, but I don't know.
I mean, it's just this idea that we're all going to agree if we're going to live here, we're all going to do this thing so that, we just a social contract. You got to wear shoes in the store. We're all going to wear shoes. And then,
it's like anything they perceive as new. Because I know it's been pointed out a million times before, but all those people, mostly, they got all the standard vaccines we've all been getting for years, and never cared, never bothered them, never had any issue with it. Right. But like when a new thing comes up, they just can't handle it. Like I've seen other people say, and I think it's true. Like if we'd never had fire departments before, if they didn't exist and they got proposed right now, I think people would be calling that commie. Am I allowed to cuss? I can't ever remember.
Yeah, of course.
No. Yeah, people would be calling that commie bullshit, and get that socialist shit out of here if somebody proposed fire departments tomorrow if they didn't exist already. So
one of the most controversial things in the last decade was the idea of health insurance.
Right. Yeah.
That everybody,
if we had that already for a long, they wouldn't think twice about it, but it becomes an argument because we don't. Right.
And the rest of the world's like, wait, you guys you're not all insured? It's cheaper that way. If it's not like health insurance isn't some ingenious device. It's just a pool. Everybody gets in, price goes down, everybody's covered. There you go.
It also, you would just think that anyone could see that the idea of like, if I get hurt, I can go to the doctor and that's pretty much it. I don't have to worry about all this other stuff that anyone would be on board with.
Horrible. Horrible.
But it becomes about, poor people being lazy or whatever. And they all think they're paying for it,
And you can't pursue a thing that you would love doing because you got to go work at some fucking firm that has health insurance.
Mm-hmm.
Like I want to create wood shop and sell my devices on Etsy, but I got to have health insurance in case I cut a finger off. So I guess I can't pursue that.
I think there's also some people out there who like the idea of people doing what you just said. They're not into that because they haven't. You know what I mean? It's like, I got to work this crap job and do this. So I don't know who they think they are, thinking they can just make wood stuff and have health insurance, but that ain't how it works in this country. And, even though like it should.
Yeah. Whatever your passion is, you should be able to give it a shot and not have to worry about getting sick. Is not, I guess it's anti-freedom. Speaking of freedom, January 6th, I know you've been making videos. You guys are obviously talking about that. A year has passed. It's Biden's first year. He gave a big press conference today, and certainly plenty to talk about in the world of politics. But how do you look back on that day, and how do you, again, see how divided we are over this? Whole bunch of police got the shit kicked out of them and got attacked, and people are still arguing that it really wasn't that big of a deal, much less the fact that the nation's capital was broken into and shit upon.
Yeah, well, we covered, I do a weekly political podcast called Weekly Skews, and that's on every Tuesday. And last night we were talking about a story that came out where a lot of people that were in the Capitol on January 6th, they later called like Nancy Pelosi's office and other offices at the Capitol inquiring as to whether or not there was a lost and found, perhaps, because they had left some items in the Capitol and would like to get them back. You know what I mean? It's like, I left my snake flag there. Like, well, we got 18 snake flags. You're going to have to be more specific. But and then what happened was they were like, yeah, let me put you on hold for a second. And they get like cops or FBI or whatever on the phone with these people. And they're like, yeah, no problem. You just give me your name, address, social security number, and we'll get that shipped right back to you. And they're like, oh, thank you. FBI, so helpful. And then, of course, they all get arrested. And the FBI is all, laughing around the coffee machine about how laughably easy this whole thing is and how stupid these people are. But I'm saying, I think it's like, it goes to show that they were so utterly convinced, completely convinced that they were in the right about what was happening, that at the time, it never entered their mind that it would be any kind of problem, that they would face any sort of repercussions or anything for it. And then, and it's really hard for people to admit they were wrong too. So even though that, over 700 arrests, people have faced consequences for it, there's still a lot of people who are unwilling to admit that it was really that big of a deal. Because they just can't admit they were wrong in the first place. Do
you ever feel empathy for them because they were duped by their president and all of their favorite media hosts that the election was stolen and they had to go and get and steal it back?
So, all right. Actually, it's kind of funny you say that. So on the show last night, we also talked about there's this guy called Rally Runner. He legally changed his name to Rally Runner. He's a St. Louis Cardinals super fan, right?
Oh, I think I might have heard something about this dude. Go ahead.
So this dude paints himself up full head to toe, bright red, and goes to St. Louis Cardinal games and does laps around the stadium, giving high fives and stuff. Changed his name to Rally Runner legally, won't tell anyone his birth name, right? And turns out that guy who does that, not the most put together dude, it seems like, because he also went to January 6th. Then Tucker Carlson, they somehow landed on the idea that that guy was a secret undercover FBI agent, which nothing about him screamed that level of competency to me. But they somehow landed on that. So he's been like dragged through the mud by his own side over this and everything. And he was on this St. Louis news program and we were showing the clips and he's like defending himself and he's on the news in his Rally Runner getup, full red face paint. And just as we were listening to this dude talk in my head, and I didn't say anything because I was like, I mean, I still am going to make fun of the guy. But listening to this dude talk, I was like, man, this guy, I don't know if this guy can live on his own. You know what I mean? Like this dude they're not all like that. But I'm saying like I listened to this guy talk and I was like, I don't think this guy is a self-sufficient adult. I think he's got other adults that have to take care of him or whatever. And so some of them like, so I started to feel some empathy for that dude. I thought, 'cause it's like, I can't even really understand just how profoundly dumb this person is. And so if you know, put yourself in their shoes and read all the stuff. I actually have a bit I do on stage where talking about, like, you can't show a motherfucker that dumb some shit that crazy and expect everything to just be okay, you know? And I do think there's some truth to that, but it was so egregious and the stakes are so high that, generally speaking, no, I don't feel that way. And I also think a lot of them they're not all like that. Plenty of them are more competent and do understand what's happening, and that's the outcome that they want. And I have no empathy for those people. So, yeah.
What over the past year, how have things changed for you and your family and your life and career as it regards, like, the world and the changing politics? Have you made any, like, different major choices? I mean, COVID has created so much uncertainty for everybody's work. Have there been any, like, major changes in your life or breakthroughs or decisions that you've made as a result of how shit's changing? Because I just hear people all the time being like, you know what, fuck this, I'm moving. You know what, screw this, I'm not doing this job anymore. Have you had any great resignation moments?
This isn't exactly what you're asking, but it popped into my head. I used to have a thing when I first started. I mean, I've been doing this internet video shit for over 5 years now. And early on, I tried to be somewhat even-handed, actually. Like, I would call out, like, hateful shit, like racism and things like that. But I would try to sort of I try to be fair to people on the other side because I grew up where I grew up and I feel like I know them and whatnot. But over the past couple of years with everything between January 6th and COVID and the response to it and all that, and people going to school, I've got a 9 and 10-year-old son, people going to school boards and threatening to kill doctors and just screaming about all that shit and everything. I just sort of reached a point where I was like, yeah, I don't really care anymore about that. I mean, about being like, giving them any kind of leeway or anything or holding back or being like, well, you know, you got to understand, you know, it's like, it's just gotten to a point with me with a lot of this stuff where I'm just like, no, fuck these people. And that's pretty much all I feel about that. Like a great resignation moment. I mean, no, I will say I have felt kind of dumb living in Los Angeles during all this because I've been paying the cost of living, you know, how much it costs to live here without really any of the benefits because everything's just on Zoom like we're doing now. Do you know what I mean? Like I could do this from anywhere.
Right.
But I'm still here, though. Part of it is because, like, every now and then I'll think about moving back home to Tennessee or something. If the boys miss their grandparents and things like that.
Meemaw.
But they miss Meemaw, you know. But then I see some of these clips, many of which are from Tennessee, of people losing their minds at school boards. And my sons are, you know, fourth and fifth grade, or about to be fourth and fifth graders. And I just think about that, and I'm like, yeah, I don't know about all that, you know, like plunging them back into that.
Get ready, it's coming to schools everywhere. I'm in the fight.
Oh yeah,
I'm in the fight right now. Literally, like just before I talked to you, I dealt with it, and just after I'm talking to you, I'm dealing with it. I'm told a news crew at my daughter's high school right now about this exact stuff, and we live in, you know, New York State, just north of New York City. I mean, it's everywhere because people, the whites, Trey, are terrified. They're
out
terrified.
Of control. These white people out of control. Let me tell you. No, that I'm in Burbank, California. There's been news crews at our school too, and the school boards have like multiple emergency meetings that end up lasting 10 hours because people call in or whatever and go on these long, the same type of stuff you see. It's just not as prevalent and not seemingly quite as crazy, but these people are, yes, I mean, you're right. It's everywhere. They've had this like concerted effort to be more involved at like a local level. It's like a mission they have going to, and that's like a real bummer in my opinion, because I think at lower levels, a smaller group of people can actually make things happen.
That's why I so encourage people to get engaged. Like I'm meeting I'm meeting these people exactly where they're at. Otherwise, they're going to run all over us. And how do you respond to the accusations and the criticisms that are made that are saying things like, you know, they're teaching white people to feel like they are lesser than and that they should be ashamed, and all these travesties that happened in the past, they're saying you're you're at fault right now. You're the perpetrator. What do you make of those types of arguments? Because they are everywhere now. I mean, you hear that from them all the time.
So, I mean, I grew up in the rural South, and I was taught, I feel like my school wasn't as bad, but I definitely got taught some misleading war between the states type stuff as a kid. And then later, like college age, whatnot, found out, no, it wasn't true. It was 100%. I was taught that it was debatable whether it was really about slavery and that type of thing. But, slavery did happen and it was horrible. And that's sort of what I had. Then I got to college and found out that's not true. It was 100% about slavery, and my point is, at no point in learning all the actual truth of the matter, learning the reality, at no point was I like lying awake at night wondering like, oh, damn, does this mean I'm in the Klan? Like I'm inherently evil, because I'm descended from these people. I never internalized it that way. I have sons in school. They're in school in Southern California, but they're from Tennessee. All their families from Tennessee. They know that. They know that Tennessee was a slave state. They know that people had slaves. They know about the Civil War. They know all at a very basic elementary school level, but they've learned those things. And they also have never been they've never taken any of it personally. Like they've never heard any of that and been like, what does that mean about our people? Right. Are we broken? Or, kids don't interpret things that way, So all we're really talking about is just teaching them the truth. And if that type of mentality is seeping in, it's coming from the adults and the parents involved. You know what I mean? And it's not a school system issue. It's on them to make that better or to, avoid that happening. So it's stupid, man.
Yeah, it is. But it's really scary what people have been led to believe. It's wild to think that, just huge percentages of white folks identify as being victims and more discriminated against than black and brown people or gay people, whatever. White people are now the victims in this country. I mean, did you hear Trump the other night saying white people can't get the vaccine? Now they're giving it to black people for why you're doing that. Like, it is really, really naked now, the kind of race war rhetoric. And I just wonder where that leaves the liberal whites.
Yeah, no, I don't know. I mean, you're right. They've been in love with the idea of being persecuted for a long time, especially like the Christian right. They've been talking about how really they are more persecuted, the war on Christmas and stuff. And like they've had that narrative going for a long time, but it's like burning out of control now. And yeah, it's insane. It's got to be hilarious to actual oppressed groups in this country. Well, not hilarious, upsetting too, but just the audacity of white people to act like that. Like that, the only racism left in this country is racism against white people. It's like, what black people or black institutions are keeping you from doing anything? Like, in what way are you being held down or oppressed? It's just like, you can't say slavery wasn't so bad anymore. You know what I mean? Or you can't use certain slurs or tell jokes you like anymore without somebody, coming back at you for it. And that's what makes you think that, white people are so downtrodden, or what? Because I don't understand what their actual complaints are, Do
you worry? I mean, what is your biggest concern? I know you've been ranting and talking a lot about the voting rights issue, which is also just a crazy that we're here. I like those who are framing it like you got to pick a side. Like this, we're looking back at history, and we can see who picked which sides and who represented. The new Jim Crow is not too far from me to that kind of rhetoric. I think that's exactly what we're seeing. It's different. It's different techniques. It's different tactics. But the bottom line is the result is the same, to try to prevent certain people from voting, period. Mm-hmm. And, you had an amazing rant about Kirsten Sinema the other day. What do you make? I kind of give a pass to some extent to the Biden administration and Democrats, because without what can they do? I'm not sure what exactly they could have been doing differently on this issue of voting rights. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think I'm with you on that. I think I'm frustrated too, but I have wondered the same thing. I mean, it feels like there's basically two bad actors in the way of them, because you talk about them, it's like they're not getting any, they have power, but they're not getting anything done. And, how are we supposed to interpret that? But like, it feels like outside, if it wasn't for Manchin and Sinema, and of course it would have to be two actual Democrats in their place, then they would be passing things and we wouldn't be having this conversation, it seems like. Or maybe the corporate puppet masters would just get to someone else if they weren't in that position. I don't know. But either way, yeah, I mean, it doesn't seem like it's for lack of trying. I know that it's frustrating, but I don't really know what they're supposed to do about it either. Yeah, it's upsetting.
What's coming up for you guys? I want to just, this might be boring to talk about. It's more like, hey, just go watch it. But I love when you sit in your car and rant. And I also hate it because you're very good at it. And I'm like, I don't think I could be that good. I think I'd have to do a lot of editing. It looks like you do it in one shot. So I love it. It's very good. I like to watch them. They seem to get hundreds of thousands of views every time. But I hate it because you're making it look easy. And if I did that, I think I might get single digits and then want to blow my head off. Those are great. So what can you tell me?
I think it's just the accent, man. You just learned to fake this accent. I think that's really all it is.
Hello, I'm Pete Dominic. It's like I'm doing a different thing now.
It was a silly accent. Yeah, no, but I appreciate you saying that. Yeah, I'm surprised that people are still watching them, but they are. And I've been doing them, like I said, for 5 years now, so I do kind of have it, down, the formula down. But yeah, glad people still like them. But sorry, I cut you off though.
No, I mean, it just, I just wanted to mention how good they are and how much I like them to your face. So you can watch, obviously follow Trey on everything. I'll have all the plugs after I'm done talking to you here, man. I'm just, I'm a big fan of what you've been doing and what you and your boys are doing. And, I'll be listening and watching and always appreciate when you stop by and talk to me. And my, listeners to this show, I know a lot of them listening to you guys and love when we talk. So thanks for joining me today, bud.
Absolutely. Likewise. Always a pleasure. Big fan of you too. And I'm glad, you've been having me on pretty much that whole time. So thank you.
That's
I appreciate
awesome, man.
it.
I'll talk to you soon. Thanks, Trey. All right, Trey Crowder, how about it? Yeah, love that guy. Love our conversations. Great to get him back on the show. I'll reach out to Corey, and I've got to get Drew on, too. I've never had Drew on. I don't know why I've minimized Drew Morgan so much of the trio. He must feel really left out. He's probably losing sleep over it. I'll definitely reach out to him and get him on. All right, go follow Trey if you haven't on Twitter. Watch his videos. They're great. Love talking to that guy. And, of course, Andrea Chalupa. And that's what I've got for you. Again, sorry I didn't get to the news today. Happens when I get wrapped up and other things that, frankly, tonight it was just too important because I had to prevent the story from going on NBC News. I'll tell you more about that at tonight's Hangout, as well as welcoming Peter Coyote, scheduled to join us tonight at 8 East. If you're not a subscriber, you should subscribe just for this. Just for this. I mean, it's $5 a month, so add that up. That's easily what you'd pay to go to a theater to hear one of the greatest thinkers and voiceover actors and writers. And Peter Coyote joining us tonight. I hope you'll join us and sign up if you haven't already. And we will send you the link, and you can hang out with us, and I'll tell you the story of what happened today, although you're likely to hear about it if it does end up getting reported. So that's it for me. John Carroll taking us out. I hope to see you tonight, folks. With other causes for laws and sins that weren't even sin. They knew that change was gonna come before the change could begin. They had to stand up. All right, they had to stand up. We got to stand up. We got to look the devil square in the eye. We gotta let him know it's his time to go and make it clear when all we hear is a lie. Why you lying awake wondering where the money all went? It'll be the cost of freedom that'll go unspent. You can see him flee the scene of that experiment if you stand up. All right, we got to speak up, we got to reach up and raise your voice in every way you know how. Don't be toes up, you got to show up. Ain't no better time to do it but now. No need to pledge allegiance to no wanton tribe. Rise up, show obedience to the voice inside, and listen well and it'll tell you not to run and hide. It says stand up. Stand up. Ooh, come on, just stand up. Everybody got to stand up in the darkest hour. Stand up. People got the power. Stand up. Come on, come on, come on. Come on, come on, come on. Come on, come on, come on. Stand